Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I came to West Virginia to walk myself clean. That's how my grandmother used to put it, walking yourself clean when the world got too heavy. 3 months after losing my job and 6 months after Sarah left, I figured the Appalachian trail section through the Monongahela National Forest might scrub away whatever was eating at me from the inside out. The ranger at the Seneca Rocks Visitor Center was helpful enough, marking my map with a ballpoint pen that skipped every few letters. He circled the standard campsites, traced the main trail with his finger, and warned me about the weather turning. What he didn't mark, what I noticed only when I spread the map across my dashboard later, was a thin creek line that curled off the main trail about 12 miles in, leading to what looked like a small valley completely enclosed by ridge lines. No trail markers, no campsite symbols, just topographical lines suggesting a hollow tucked so deep into the mountains that cartographers might have missed it entirely. I should have stuck to the marked trail. Should have pitched my tent at the designated site like every other weekend warrior with a brand new REI backpack and something to prove. But that unmarked hollow pulled at me like gravity, the way gaps in conversation make you want to fill them with words. The hike-in was standard Appalachian fare, switchbacks through oak and hickory, with the occasional patch of rhododendron thick enough to make you feel like you were walking through a green tunnel. My boots found purchase on shale and sandstone, and the familiar ache in my calves felt good, real in a way nothing had felt for months. The air tasted of moss and last year's leaves, sharp with the promise of rain. I found the creek around mile 11, just where the map suggested. No trail marker, no beaten path, just a game trail wide enough for deer, winding alongside water that ran black over smooth stones. The sound of it was different from the main creek I'd been following all morning. Quieter, more secretive. The game trail led downhill through stands of ancient hemlock, their trunks thick enough that 3 people couldn't wrap their arms around them. Spanish moss hung in gray curtains, and somewhere in the canopy above, a pileated woodpecker hammered out its territorial rhythm. The deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The understory grew sparse, and the air took on a stillness that felt intentional, like the trees were holding their breath. When I reached the floor of the hollow, I understood why it wasn't on any trail map. The place felt separate from the rest of the forest, protected by walls of stone and green so complete that standing in the center, you couldn't see how you'd gotten in. The creek pooled into a small pond before disappearing underground, and scattered around the water's edge were the remains of what had once been a settlement. Not much left, a few foundation stones, the collapsed remains of what might have been a mill wheel, and in the center of it all, a small church with its roof caved in and walls blackened by fire. The structure couldn't have been much bigger than a single-room schoolhouse, built from local sandstone with a wooden bell tower that listed to one side like a broken finger. The silence was complete. No bird calls, no insect hum, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. If you've ever spent a night near an Appalachian hollow, you'll know the kind of quiet I'm talking about. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something that makes sound irrelevant. The kind of quiet that gets inside your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. I should have turned around, should have hiked back to the main trail and pitched my tent somewhere with cell service and other hikers close enough to hear if something went wrong. Instead, I dropped my pack beside the ruined church and started exploring. The fire that had gutted the building was old, decades, maybe longer, but the stone walls still stood, and carved into the lintel above the doorway was a date, 1847. Below it, someone had carved a symbol I didn't recognize, 3 interlocking circles with lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. Inside, charred pews sat in neat rows facing an altar that had somehow survived the flames. The altar itself was simple, a slab of local slate supported by 2 carved stone pedestals. But what caught my attention was what sat on top of it. A small wooden figure, maybe 6 inches tall, carved from what looked like mountain laurel. The detail was extraordinary. A human form with its arms raised toward the sky, but the face was wrong. Too many eyes, too many teeth, and the wood itself seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. I picked it up without thinking, the way you might pick up an interesting stone or a pretty feather. The wood was warm to the touch, smooth from handling, and it felt older than anything had a right to feel. Older than the church, older than the settlement, older than the trees that surrounded the hollow like guardians. That's when I noticed the other figures. They were small, easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Carved from the same dark wood, each one slightly different but unmistakably part of a set. I found them tucked into crevices in the stone walls, half buried in the soil around the altar, and one, the largest of the lot, sitting in what had once been the pulpit. Each figure was carved with the same impossible attention to detail, and each one had that same wrong face. Too many features arranged in patterns that hurt to look at directly. But it was more than that. The longer I stared at them, the more I became convinced that they were staring back. I gathered them all, 13 in total, and arranged them on the altar the way I imagined they were meant to be arranged. The moment I placed the last one, the silence in the hollow grew deeper, if that was possible. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, as if the air itself had thickened. The sun was getting low and I needed to set up camp before dark. I told myself I'd put the figures back where I found them in the morning, but for now, I left them arranged on the altar and went about the business of making camp. My tent went up easily enough in a clearing beside the church, and I managed to get a small fire started with dead wood from the forest floor. The flames felt good against the evening chill, but they also seemed wrong somehow. Too bright in all that darkness, too alive in all that stillness. I ate my dinner from a pouch and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked up from the fire, I expected to see eyes reflecting the light from the tree line. Instead, I saw only darkness pressing in from all sides, solid and impenetrable. The carved figures were still visible through the doorway of the ruined church, silhouetted against the lighter stone of the altar. Even from 50 feet away, I could feel them pulling at my attention like a tooth that wouldn't stop aching. I tried to read, tried to write in my journal, tried to do anything that would keep my eyes off that doorway. Nothing worked. Around midnight, I gave up on sleep and added more wood to the fire. That's when I heard it. A sound like singing, but not quite. More like humming, if humming could come from underground and work its way up through the roots of trees and the foundations of ruined buildings. The sound was coming from the direction of the church, but when I looked that way, everything appeared normal. The figures sat motionless on the altar, just dark shapes against lighter stone. But the humming continued, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby or a hymn heard in childhood. I grabbed my flashlight and approached the church, my feet crunching on fallen leaves that sounded too loud in the stillness. The humming grew stronger as I got closer, resonating up through the soles of my boots and into my bones. Inside the church, the figures had changed position. Not dramatically. I might have convinced myself I was imagining it if I hadn't spent so much time staring at them earlier. But they had definitely moved. The one I'd placed in the center now stood slightly apart from the others, and its raised arms seemed to point not toward the sky, but toward the back wall of the church. I followed its gaze with my flashlight beam and saw what I'd missed before. Another carving in the stone. This one much larger than the symbol above the door. It covered most of the back wall, etched deep into the sandstone with the same careful attention to detail as the wooden figures. The design was complex, interlocking spirals that seemed to shift and writhe in the moving light, surrounding a central image that my brain kept trying to interpret as a face, then a landscape, then something else entirely. The humming was definitely coming from the wall. I pressed my ear against the cold stone and felt vibrations running through it like the echo of distant machinery. But there was nothing behind that wall except tons of mountain stone and earth. I spent the rest of the night sitting by my fire, watching the church doorway and listening to that underground song. Every time I started to doze, the humming would change pitch or rhythm, jolting me awake with the certainty that something was moving in the darkness beyond the firelight. Dawn came slowly, filtered through the canopy above until the hollow filled with gray, grudging light. The humming had stopped sometime before sunrise. but the silence that replaced it felt loaded with potential, like the moment before thunder. I broke camp quickly, stuffing my gear into my pack with hands that shook more than they should have, but I couldn't bring myself to leave without looking at the figures one more time. They had moved again. All 13 now faced the carved wall, their wrong faces turned toward that spiral design like worshippers at prayer. And in the center of the altar, where I was certain there had been empty space the night before, sat a 14th figure. This one was different. Larger, carved from wood so dark it was almost black, and instead of raised arms, its hands were pressed flat against its sides. But it was the face that made my stomach clench with recognition. Not because it looked like me, though there was something familiar about the features, but because it looked human, completely, perfectly human in a way that made the other figure's wrongness more pronounced by comparison. I picked it up, and the wood was cold now instead of warm. Cold as stone, cold as deep water. Cold as the kind of fear that starts in your gut and works its way outward until it's all you can feel. I should have put it back. Should have left all of them arranged exactly as I'd found them and hiked out of that hollow as fast as my legs could carry me. Instead, I slipped the 14th figure into my pocket and walked away without looking back. The hike out felt different. The game trail seemed longer, the creek louder, and the forest around me buzzed with an energy that felt like barely contained electricity. Twice I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was nothing but empty trail and shifting shadows. I made it back to the main trail by noon and reached my car before sunset. The drive home should have been a relief. Hot shower, warm bed, the comfortable noise of civilization. Instead, I felt like I was carrying something heavy in my chest, something that had followed me out of that hollow and taken up residence behind my ribs. The wooden figure sits on my desk now, next to my computer and a stack of unpaid bills. Sometimes I catch myself staring at it, and I swear its expression changes depending on the light. Sometimes it looks peaceful. Sometimes it looks sad. And sometimes, usually late at night when the house is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, sometimes it looks hungry. I've done research, spent hours online looking for information about settlements in that part of the Monongahela. Found a few references to a religious community that disappeared in the 1860s, something about a fire and accusations of unnatural practices. But nothing concrete, nothing that explains the figures or the carved wall or the sound of singing from underground. What I did find, buried in a genealogy forum and mentioned only in passing, was a family name, Hewitt. A woman named Constance Hewitt, who led what the records called a heretical congregation in the mountains until a fire destroyed their meeting house in 1863. No survivors mentioned, no bodies found. Constance Hewitt. The name feels familiar in a way I can't explain, like something I heard once in a dream and half remembered upon waking. The figure on my desk seems to grow heavier each day, as if it's absorbing something from the air around it. And at night, when the house settles and the city noise fades to a whisper, I sometimes hear humming, faint but persistent, coming from no direction I can identify. I know I should go back, should return the figure to its place on that altar and leave the hollow to its secrets. But every time I plan the trip, something stops me. Work, weather, the simple fact that some doors, once opened, were never meant to be closed again. The humming is getting stronger, and sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, I find myself humming along, harmony to a melody I never learned, words in a language I don't recognize but somehow understand. The hollow that maps forgot remembers everything, and now I think it remembers me. I came to Sorrow Bark Trace because my daughter's voice had started following me through the apartment walls. 3 months after the accident, I'd catch fragments of her humming in the bathroom pipes, her giggle echoing from the neighbor's television. The grief counselor called it auditory hallucinations. I called it hell. So when my brother mentioned the old logging road up near Hawkfen Hollow, where our grandfather used to hunt morel mushrooms, I packed my truck with enough supplies for a week. Sometimes the only way to silence the ghosts is to find a place where they can't follow. The trace began where the county road surrendered to kudzu and wild grapevines. I'd driven these mountains before, but never noticed how the trees seemed to lean inward here, their branches forming a tunnel of mountain laurel and witch hazel. The deeper I climbed, the more the forest changed. Galax leaves carpeted the forest floor in perfect spirals, and ghost pipe, those pale, waxy flowers that feed on decay, sprouted from every fallen log. By the time I reached the old hunting cabin my grandfather had built in 1967, the air had grown thick with something that wasn't quite mist. The cabin squatted in a grove of ancient hemlocks, their bark scarred with markings I didn't remember from childhood visits. Deep gouges spiraled up the trunks, too regular to be bear claws, too wide to be carved by human hands. I unloaded my gear as the sun dropped behind the ridge, and that's when I first noticed the silence. Not the peaceful quiet of evening settling in, but something wrong, an absence that pressed against my eardrums like a held breath. No whip-poor-wills called from the undergrowth, no tree frogs chirped from the creek that I could hear running somewhere below. Even the wind seemed reluctant to move through the branches. I built a fire in the old stone hearth and tried to read, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, where darkness had pooled thick as motor oil. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times to the sound of my daughter's voice calling my name from somewhere in the forest. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was just the stress of being alone, the way isolation can play tricks on a grieving mind. But when I stepped outside to gather firewood, I found fresh root bark scattered around the cabin's foundation, thin, papery strips that looked like they'd been carefully peeled away during the night. I spent the day hiking the old game trails, following the creek down into the hollow where bloodroot and trillium grew in impossible abundance. The forest felt heavy here, pregnant with something that made my skin crawl. Every step seemed to echo longer than it should, as if the sound was bouncing off walls I couldn't see. And everywhere I looked, more trees bore those strange spiral scars, as if something had been methodically marking territory. That evening, I discovered the source of the scattered bark. Something had been peeling strips from the cabin's log walls, working in perfect spirals that matched the marks on the trees. The wood underneath was pale and soft, almost flesh-like. When I touched it, my finger came away wet with a sap that smelled like iron and old leaves. If you've ever watched a forest forget how to be a forest, you'll understand what I found on the third morning. The trees had moved during the night, not far, just enough to make the familiar paths feel foreign. Landmarks I'd memorized were suddenly 20 feet to the left or right. The creek that had been running east to west now flowed north to south, and the silence had deepened, becoming something almost solid. I tried to leave that afternoon, but every trail led back to the cabin. The forest had become a maze with only one destination. As darkness fell, I built up the fire and waited. The thing that lived in Sorrowbark Trace was done being subtle. It came with the sound of wood splitting, but not the sharp crack of breaking timber, something softer, more organic, like bones separating at the joints. The spiral scars on the trees began to weep that iron-scented sap, and I realized they weren't scars at all. They were seams. The bark was parting along those perfect spirals, revealing something underneath that hurt to look at directly. The trees were breathing. Their trunks expanded and contracted with a rhythm that reminded me of a ventilator, the same mechanical wheeze that had filled my daughter's hospital room for 3 days before we finally let her go. And with each breath, they were shedding their bark like old skin, revealing something pale and glistening underneath. I understood then what lived in the trace. Not a creature or a spirit, but something that fed on the hollow spaces that grief carves out of people. It had been waiting here, patient as the mountains themselves, for someone hollow enough to sustain it. The forest wasn't haunted, it was hungry. The cabin's walls began to weep with the same iron-scented sap. The logs groaned and shifted, their bark peeling away in long strips that looked like bandages coming undone. I could hear my daughter's voice more clearly now, calling to me from the breathing trees, but I knew it wasn't really her. It was just the echo of my own emptiness, given shape and substance by something that had been feeding on sorrow for longer than there had been words to name it. I don't remember how I got out of the trace. I came to at dawn, parked at a gas station in Beckley with no memory of driving there. The attendant said I'd been sitting in my truck for hours, staring at the mountains. When I checked my phone, I'd been gone for 6 days, not 3. But I brought something back with me. On quiet nights, I can still hear the trees breathing, their rhythm matching the sound of my daughter's ventilator. And sometimes, when the grief gets too heavy, I catch myself peeling strips of bark from the paper birch in my yard, watching them spiral down like the unwinding of something that was never meant to heal. The sap under my fingernails still smells like iron and old leaves, and I know that somewhere in the mountains, the trace is still hungry, still waiting for the next hollow soul to wander up that forgotten logging road. Some hungers are too ancient to die, and some sorrows run too deep for even the mountains to swallow whole. I came to Sourwood Gap carrying my father's ashes and 43 years of questions I'd never asked him. The grief counselor said I needed closure, but what I really needed was to understand why he'd spent every October driving 3 hours into these mountains, alone, returning hollow-eyed and silent for weeks after. The gap wasn't on any official trail map, just a pencil scratch on his hunting journal with coordinates that led me up a forgotten logging road. October mist clung to the ridgeline like old cobwebs, and the sourwood trees had turned that particular shade of burgundy that makes the whole forest look like it's bleeding from the inside. I parked where the road died into a tangle of rhododendron and started walking. The path was real enough at first, marked by boot prints that might have been his. Mountain laurel pressed close on both sides, their twisted branches forming a tunnel of green-black leaves. I'd brought his ashes in a canvas bag, thinking I'd scatter them at whatever place had called to him all those years. The weight of the bag against my hip felt heavier with each step, like grief itself was gaining mass. That's when I noticed the silence. Not the comfortable quiet of deep woods, but something else. A held breath, a pause between heartbeats. The whip-poor wills that had been calling from the valley below had stopped. Even the October flies had gone quiet. If you've ever walked into a room where people were just talking about you, you'll know the quality of stillness I mean. The forest was listening. The path curved downward into what the old-timers might have called a hollow, though no creek ran through it. Instead, ghost pipes sprouted from the forest floor in clusters of bone-white stems, those strange flowers that look like tiny hands reaching up through the earth. They grew thicker as I descended, until the ground looked carpeted with pale fingers. I found the first breath mark carved into a tulip poplar, a perfect oval gouged deep into the bark about the size of a human mouth. The wood inside was black, not with rot, but with something that seemed to pull light into itself. More trees bore the same marks, all at chest height, all facing the path like a procession of silent screams. The ghost pipe began to move, not swaying with wind, there was no wind in that hollow, but pulsing gently, rhythmically, like they were breathing. The white stems expanded and contracted in perfect unison, and I realized I was matching their rhythm without meaning to. My chest rose and fell with theirs, and each breath felt thinner than the last. The path ended at a clearing where bloodroot had grown in a perfect circle, their heart-shaped leaves rust red with autumn. In the center stood something that wasn't quite a tree. It had bark and branches, but they were wrong, too symmetrical, too purposeful. The trunk was riddled with those same mouth-shaped hollows, hundreds of them, and from each one came the softest sound, the whisper of an exhale. That's when I understood what my father had been doing here every October. The tree, the thing, wasn't taking breaths. It was giving them back. Every hollow was someone's last exhalation, preserved in wood and darkness. I could feel them all, dozens of final sighs trapped in that patient bark, and underneath the whispers, I heard something that made my knees buckle. My father's voice, breathless and broken, calling my name. I don't remember dropping the bag of ashes or falling to my knees in that circle of bloodroot. I only remember pressing my mouth to one of those hollows and breathing in, desperate to taste whatever remained of him in that darkness. The hollow was warm and wet, like the inside of a lung, and when I breathed deep, I felt something vital leave me. Not my breath, but the breath beneath my breath, the one that had been mine since birth. The tree shuddered, bark rippling like skin, and a new hollow began to form just above where I knelt. My hollow, waiting. I ran then, crashing through the ghost pipe, their pale stems snapping under my feet like small bones. Behind me, the tree exhaled 100 whispered names, and one of them was mine. I made it to the car with lungs that felt like empty bags, drove home gasping like a fish out of water. That was 3 months ago. I still wake each night to the sound of my own breathing, but it sounds wrong now, too shallow, like I'm borrowing air that belongs to someone else. Sometimes in the quiet before dawn, I hear the tree calling from Sourwood Gap, offering to complete what we started. My hollow is still there, half-formed and patient. And every October I feel the pull growing stronger, the need to return and give back what isn't really mine to keep. The breathtaker is waiting as it waited for my father, as it waits for all of us who carry too much grief in our chests. Some debts I'm learning can only be paid with the currency of our last exhale.